The smell arrives before the memory does. It is a compound thing, enamel paint and model cement, and underneath both of those, the sharp sweetness of nitromethane fuel. The same fuel that soaked into the small tin tank of a control line model aircraft somewhere in the mid-1960s or the early 1970s, or whenever the afternoon in question happened to take place. The enamel was Testors, almost certainly those small square glass bottles with the brushed aluminum caps that appeared in virtually every dime store and hardware store and hobby shop in the United States in the post-war decades, arranged in rows of flat color and metallics, each one so small that it fit between two fingers and yet contained enough pigment to finish a model aircraft or a plastic car or a battleship or anything else. A person with patience and a brush was willing to give an afternoon. The smell of that enamel is a specific thing. It is not the smell of house paint. It is sharper, more chemical, and it carries with it the particular associations of something being made rather than something being applied, of transformation rather than maintenance. Underneath the paint, for a specific portion of the hobby's population, there was the engine. Hold the Testor's McCoy engine in both hands. The McCoy that Testors acquired when it bought out Duromatic products in 1955, adding Dick McCoy's legendary designs to the Rockford, Illinois product catalog. The engine is small enough to hold between your thumb and forefinger, a machined aluminum and steel object weighing just a few ounces, and yet everything about it is intentional. The cooling fins cut into the cylinder head, the needle valve extending from the carburetor body like a fine adjustment waiting to be made. The glow plug threaded into the head, its filament waiting for the igniter battery to bring it to heat. The propeller bolted to the drive shaft with a single retaining nut that you have to hold against the spring tension of the compression stroke while you tighten it. A task that requires both hands and a kind of attention that 12-year-olds in 1963 understood completely. You have primed the engine. You have connected the glow igniter, a battery in a plastic housing with a small spring clip that attaches to the plug terminal. And you can feel through the clip that the plug is hot, that the coil inside the plug is glowing orange-white at the temperature the fuel requires to ignite. You have checked the needle valve setting, one turnout from closed, which the instruction sheet said was correct for initial starting, and which you have adjusted from there based on what happened the last time you tried, which was yesterday, and which did not result in a successful first flight so much as a result that taught you several specific things about the relationship between fuel mixture and combustion. You flip the propeller. The compression resists your finger at the top of the stroke, firm and specific, the way a living thing resists being disturbed. The engine does not start. You flip it again. Nothing. You check the plug connection. You prime the intake with a single drop of fuel. Just a drop. Because more than that floods the combustion chamber, and you will be waiting for 4 minutes while the excess disperses and trying to remember what you did differently than you were supposed to. The third flip, or the fifth or the seventh, the engine coughs. One bark, one syllable of mechanical intention. And then you adjust the needle a fraction of a turn and flip again, and the engine crosses from cough into run, from potential into reality, and the sound it makes is everything. If that sound is still somewhere in your memory, if reading these words is locating something you hadn't thought about in years, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, not for the algorithm. So stories like this one don't disappear in the same quiet way that so many of the things they describe have disappeared. This channel exists to keep these histories in front of the people who live them and the people who deserve to know they existed. Rockford, Illinois is a city built on manufacturing. Machine tools, fasteners, hardware, the kind of industrial production that the upper Midwest excelled at through the better part of the 20th century. It sits on the Rock River about 90 miles northwest of Chicago, and in 1929, when a Swedish immigrant named Niels Testor took over a small nitrocellulose cement company from a man named Axel Carlson, who had concluded that the American market for shoe cement was not as large as he had hoped. Rockford was exactly the kind of working city where a person with a product and some determination could build something real. Niels Testor had been managing an F.W. Woolworth store in Rockford's Swedish district when Carlson approached him. He was a manager by training and a salesman by temperament, and he understood immediately that the nitrocellulose cement Carlson had been failing to sell to cobblers had other applications that Carlson had not pursued. He renamed it Crystal Clear Household Cement and began marketing it across the range of uses that a nitrocellulose adhesive could serve. By the mid-1930s, the company had expanded into model airplane cement and butyrate dope, the chemical used to shrink and seal the tissue paper covering that went over the balsa frames of the flying models that a growing number of Americans were spending their leisure hours constructing. Testor became a founding member of the hobby industry of America in 1940. The war years were difficult in the specific way they were difficult for every civilian manufacturer. Raw materials were rationed, production priorities were military, and the company had to adapt or contract. Testor adapted by manufacturing static scale models of popular aircraft from pine wood, which were both a patriotic product and a practical one in a period when balsa was largely reserved for military applications. Fire at the main Rockford facility in February 1944 destroyed the upper 2 floors of the 4-story brick building and caused more than $200,000 in damage. Serious money for a mid-sized Midwestern manufacturing company in the mid-1940s. Testor rebuilt within a year, and when the war ended, the company found itself in an unusually good position. The post-war surplus of balsa wood, which had been manufactured in enormous quantities for military aircraft applications, was suddenly available for civilian use, and Testor was positioned to buy it and put it to work. This is where the world that the Testor's engine eventually inhabited took shape. The post-war model aviation boom was not an accident. It was the convergence of several forces that happened to arrive simultaneously. The surplus of materials, the return of men who had been in intimate contact with aircraft during the war, the prosperity of the post-war economy, the expansion of suburban residential life that created the garages and basements where models were built, and the particular American cultural moment of the late 1940s and 1950s that made the making of things, the patient, skill-developing, failure-tolerating making of physical things, a normal and celebrated way to spend time. The hobby shop was the institution that made all of this work. Not a chain, but a specific kind of small retail space that existed in most American towns of any size through the post-war decades. A place where the inventory was the knowledge of the person who ran it, where you could buy Testor's enamel by the bottle and model cement by the tube and balsa sheets, by the width and the glow plug and the fuel and the engine that went into the nose of the aircraft, and where the advice about which engine and which fuel and what to do when it wouldn't start was included in the price of the transaction. The man behind the counter at a well-run hobby shop in 1957 or 1962 or 1970 was not a retail employee in any meaningful sense. He was a practitioner of the hobby who happened to also be selling the materials for it. He had been in the hobby for years, had built dozens of the kits the shop carried, had run most of the engines in the display case, and had opinions, specific, grounded, useful opinions about which kit was appropriate for a beginner and which required prior experience, and what to do when the needle valve on a particular engine was behaving in a particular way. These opinions were freely offered and deeply trusted, because they came from experience and were offered without any motive beyond keeping the customer functioning and returning. The shop thrived when its customers learned, and the expertise of the counterperson was the mechanism through which that learning happened. Walk into the hobby shop as a 12-year-old in 1963 with 2 weeks of lawn mowing money and a vague desire to have something that flies. And the conversation you receive is an education in itself. The counterperson assesses what you are, what you know, and what you can reasonably be expected to accomplish. They steer you away from the ambitious kit that will defeat you and toward the one that will challenge you enough to develop skill without destroying your confidence. They sell you the right engine for the kit and the right fuel for the engine and the glow igniter you will need, and the prop size that the instruction sheet recommends. They tell you what to do when it floods, and they tell you to come back when it doesn't work, which it probably won't the first time. Testor's entry into the engine business arrived through the partnership with Duromatic products in the McCoy engine line. Dick McCoy had been designing engines since the late 1940s. The McCoy Redhead series, named for the distinctive anodized aluminum cylinder head, were among the most respected control line and free flight engines in American model aviation. Charlie Miller, the president of Duromatic, had been a central figure in the early glow plug engine world, having obtained some of the first glow plugs from Ray Arden at the 1946 Wichita Nationals, and discovered almost immediately that the McCoy engines ran considerably stronger on glow ignition than on spark. The partnership between Miller's Duromatic and Testor began in 1949 with a joint marketing agreement. Testor props designed to work with McCoy engines, McCoy engines designed to work with Testor model aircraft, and deepened until Miller sold Duromatic to Testor outright in 1955. Miller went with the sale and eventually became president of the Testor Corporation. The combined entity was, by the late 1950s, one of the most comprehensive suppliers to the American model aviation hobby. Engines and props and aircraft kits and the paints and cements and covering materials to finish them. You could walk into a hobby shop and buy everything Testors made and have, if not a complete hobby, at least the materials for one. The Testors McCoy engine line that emerged from the merger was positioned differently from the more competitive performance engines of the period. The Fox engines were known for their power in speed events. The K&B engines were known for their precision and their reliability in competition contexts. The Testors McCoy line occupied a different space. Genuinely capable engines, respected within the hobby, produced at a price point that made them accessible to the people who were entering the hobby for the first time. The people who were buying their first control line kit and needed an engine that would reward patience without punishing ignorance too harshly. McCoy, the McCoy Redhead. The McCoy, these were the engines that appeared in the plans and in the advertisements of the era alongside Testor's aircraft kits, and they were accessible in ways that went beyond price. They were engines that a beginner could learn on. The needle valve was responsive enough that small adjustments had discernible effects. The starting procedure was comprehensible to someone who had read the instruction sheet carefully and was willing to work through it methodically. They were engines that assumed good faith on the part of the user and tended to reward it. The position testers occupied in the American model hobby market was not the position of a specialist's tool. It was the position of the company that met you at the door. The square glass bottles of enamel were in the dime store, not just the hobby shop. The model cement was in the hardware store. The aircraft kits were designed to be buildable by someone who was genuinely new to the process. And the engines, when they were part of the package, were designed to be operated by someone who was learning, with the specific, earned patience that learning through physical things requires. Open the box. The first thing you encounter is the instruction sheet, folded small so it fits against the side of the kit, and it unfolds to reveal something that is at once a plan and a set of instructions and a diagram of the finished aircraft from multiple angles. This is a technical document, even though nobody calls it that. It shows you where every part goes and why it goes there. And it assumes that you're willing to look at it carefully enough to understand what it's telling you. Then the part in a wooden kit, they are balsa sheets and spruce sticks. The balsa pre-cut in some cases and requiring cutting in others. The spruce identified by the specific stiffness of the material that the builder learns to recognize by touch after a few sessions with it. In a plastic kit, they are sprues of gray plastic, each part numbered and corresponding to a step in the instructions. In either case, they are not yet what they are going to become. They are raw material. The model does not exist yet. It exists only in the instructions and in the intention of the person holding the parts. This matters more than it might seem. The moment between the unboxing and the completion is the moment that the model building culture occupied. It was a space of becoming, a space in which the person building was also, in ways they might not have been able to articulate, building themselves. The patience required to sand a rib to the profile shown on the plane. The attention required to locate a control horn in exactly the right position, so the control linkages would work correctly. The discipline required to let the glue cure before moving to the next step, which meant waiting 20 minutes or an hour when you wanted to be at the next step already. These were not merely the conditions of model building. They were what the model building was for, in the sense that they were what it produced in the person who practiced it. The engine was the climax of this process. You could build a glider without an engine. You could build a static display model without one. The powered model, the control line flyer that circled the field on a pair of steel wires, the free flight aircraft that climbed until the engine cut and then descended in a long spiral. The early radio-controlled experiments that were the ambition of the most advanced builders of the era. The powered model required you to learn one more thing. It required you to develop a relationship with a mechanical system that had its own requirements and would communicate those requirements to you through its behavior. The Testor's McCoy engine's behavior was, for a beginner, mostly a conversation about patience. The flooding engine that refused to start after overpriming told you something clear. You had given it too much. The lean run, with its hard high sound that was somehow too eager, too urgent, too thin, that told you the needle needed to come back a fraction of a turn. The rich run, with its fat burbling sound and the white smoke of unburned fuel in the exhaust, that told you the needle needed to go the other direction. The adjustment was never mechanical in the sense of being automatic. It was always interpretive. You listened to what the engine was telling you, and you responded. That was the relationship. The oil got on your hands and stayed there. Castor oil which was the standard lubricant in model engine fuel of the era, has a particular quality of not coming off with ordinary soap. It requires detergent or something more aggressive, and even then, it leaves a trace. The modelers of the post-war decades had oil-dark hands after a flying session, in the way that musicians develop calluses, not as an injury, but as a mark. The mark of the thing they did. The Testor's enamel that went on the model's finished surface was a different smell entirely, lacquer-based, sharp and chemical in its own way, requiring a specific brush technique that you develop through practice rather than through instruction. Apply too much, and it pulls in the panel lines and obscures the detail you spent 2 hours scribing. Apply too little, and the coverage is transparent, showing the gray plastic through the color in a way that requires another coat, which means waiting for the first coat to dry, which means patience. The square Testor's bottles were calibrated in their small size for the specific task of finishing a model aircraft or a plastic car or a ship hull. Not so much that you would waste what you didn't use, not so little that you would run out before the job was done. They were designed by people who understood what the product was for, who had watched people use it and understood what the failures were and had addressed them in the design. This is the thing that is hard to communicate to someone who has not experienced it. The sense that the product was made for you, that the person who designed it understood your situation and your needs and had thought carefully about how to serve them. The Testor's product line of the 1950s and 1960s was not designed for a theoretical customer. It was designed for the specific person who was standing at the hobby shop counter with the wrong amount of money and the right amount of ambition, and who would be sitting at a kitchen table that night trying to make something work. The kits and the paints and the cements and the engines were all designed to support that person's specific situation. The world that the Testor's engine inhabited was not a static world. It was a specific moment in American cultural history, a moment when the transmission of mechanical knowledge from one generation to the next happened through shared physical activity, through the specific kind of informal apprenticeship that occurred when a father and son stood over a model together, or when a more experienced club member looked at a new member's engine setup and offered a correction, or when the person behind the hobby shop counter had been in the hobby long enough to recognize the problem and name it before the customer had finished describing it. This transmission was not organized. It had no curriculum and no credentials and no formal institutional home. It happened in garages and basements and fields and shop floors and the specific social space of the Model Aviation Club, where people who had been building and flying for years were in regular proximity to people who were beginning. The knowledge passed between them not through documents, but through observation and practice, and the specific willingness of the experienced to share what they knew with the inexperienced, which is a cultural value that has to be maintained rather than assumed. The AMA flying field was the most formal expression of this world. The Academy of Model Aeronautics, which had been organizing and credentialing model aviation clubs since the 1930s, maintained a network of chartered clubs throughout the country, each with a leased or owned flying site, a frequency board for the radio operators, a culture of instruction and mutual assistance that was both practical and social. On a Saturday morning at an AMA field in 1965 or 1972 or 1978, a person arriving with a newly completed model and a newly acquired engine was not alone. The field had veterans who had seen the same problems and solved them, and who understood that the transfer of their knowledge was part of their obligation to the community. This is the world into which Testors and the McCoy engine line put their product, not the world of the specialist competition community, where the most advanced engines from the most precise manufacturers competed at the highest level of the sport. The world of the person who was beginning. The world of the first kit and the first engine and the first field session, where everything you had built and tuned and adjusted either worked or revealed what you had gotten wrong. Testors occupied this entry point deliberately, and it was an important position to occupy because the entry point is where the next generation of the hobby comes from. The forces that eventually changed this world did not arrive with dramatic announcements. They accumulated year by year in ways that seemed manageable in isolation and were not. The video game was the first and most discussed. Not one particular game, but the progressive improvement of electronic entertainment from the late 1970s through the 1980s and into the 1990s, which created an alternative to outdoor and workshop-based leisure that was available indoors in all weather, without the friction of physical tools and physical materials and physical failure. The Atari, then the Nintendo, then the more powerful consoles that followed. Each generation of gaming technology made the alternative more compelling, more sophisticated, more capable of absorbing the leisure hours that had previously been available for building at the kitchen table. This was not a conspiracy against the model hobby. It was the normal operation of a market economy in which new entertainment technologies compete with existing ones for the finite resource of human attention and leisure time. The model hobby competed and, over the course of decades, lost ground. The youth recruitment that had sustained the hobby in the 1950s and 1960s, the entry-level kit and engine that introduced a new generation of builders, slowed as the new generation found different answers to the question of what to do with a Saturday afternoon. The liability culture that developed through the 1980s added another pressure. Model aircraft engines running on nitromethane fuel at high RPM were not toys in any meaningful sense of the word. They required adult supervision for young operators, and as American public culture became progressively more focused on the formal management of risk for children, the informal and unsupervised context in which the model hobby had traditionally transmitted itself became harder to sustain. Parks that had tolerated model aircraft flying began requiring permits. Insurance requirements for AMA clubs increased. The specific kind of casual, unorganized access to outdoor space that a generation of model builders had taken for granted was becoming less available. The offshore manufacturing pressure arrived from a different direction. Asian manufacturers, OS engines from Japan, Enya, the Taiwanese producers, were producing model engines at quality levels that had risen substantially through the 1970s and 1980s, while the price remained competitive with American production. The quality advantage that American manufacturers had commanded in the post-war period had narrowed. The specific premium for domestic manufacture, always real, always present in the cost structure, became progressively harder to justify to a customer who could see that the imported alternative performed comparably. Testors, through these years, was also navigating a series of corporate transitions that changed the company's relationship to its original mission. The Jupiter Corporation, a Chicago-based holding company, acquired Testors in 1965 for a transaction that employed approximately 450 workers, 200 of whom were based in Rockford. RPM International Republic Powdered Metals, based in Medina, Ohio, subsequently acquired the company and held it through the period in which the model hobby market was contracting most severely. Each transition brought new ownership with different primary objectives and different perspectives on what the Testor's product line was supposed to be and who it was supposed to serve. The engine side of the business became a progressively smaller portion of the total Testor's revenue picture as the paint and cement and plastic model kit businesses grew through the 1960s and 1970s. Testors had acquired the IMC Model Kit Company and the Hawk Model Company, both well-respected producers of plastic aircraft kits in the early 1970s. Later in the decade, it acquired the Italian manufacturer Italeri, which produced high-quality injection molded kits that Testors repackaged for the American market. The company was becoming year by year more of a paint and plastic kit company and less of the compound supplier of everything the hobby required: engines and props and aircraft and the chemicals to finish them, that it had been in the 1950s and early 1960s. The McCoy engine line continued under the Testor's name through these transitions, but its presence in the catalog became smaller, and its position in the market became more marginal as the hobby's needs evolved away from the control line and free flight applications that the McCoy had been designed to serve. The radio-controlled aircraft market, which was growing, required different engines, larger, more powerful, with throttle response characteristics that the McCoy's fixed-speed control line design had not been optimized for. The entry point that the Testor's McCoy combination had occupied, the accessible, affordable, beginner-friendly introduction to powered model aviation, was being contested from multiple directions simultaneously. The hobby shops that had been the distribution backbone of the system were closing. The large mail-order retailers were competing with the independent shop on price. The internet, when it arrived, competed on selection and convenience. Each hobby shop that closed took with it not just a distribution point, but a community hub, a place where the informal transmission of knowledge had happened for years and now happened nowhere. The expertise dispersed into the internet, where it was technically still available, but was no longer embedded in a relationship. There is a question at the heart of all of this that deserves to be asked directly, because it is the question that the story of Testors and the McCoy engine in the model aviation culture they participated in keeps circling back toward. It is not a simple question about business or technology or corporate decisions. It is a question about childhood and what childhood is supposed to do. What happens to a culture when the friction disappears from learning? The friction in this context is not metaphorical. It is the literal physical friction of a model airplane engine that does not start on the first attempt. That requires you to understand something about fuel mixture and compression and the specific behavior of a two-stroke internal combustion cycle before it will cooperate with you. It is the friction of a balsa rib that does not fit the plan until you have sanded it correctly, which requires you to hold it against the plan and see where it deviates and sand from that point until it doesn't. It is the friction of enamel paint that goes on wrong when you apply it too thick, and right when you understand the correct viscosity and the correct brush loading and the correct stroke technique. Understanding that you develop through this specific education of applying it wrong repeatedly and learning from each failure what you did and why it didn't work. This friction was, in the model building culture of the post-war decades, considered normal, expected, the consequence of working with physical materials and physical machines that had real properties and real requirements. Nobody described it as educational. Nobody designed it to be educational. It was simply what happened when you tried to make something work, and the education was the unavoidable consequence of the trying. The child who learned to start a Testor's McCoy engine, who learned to prime without flooding, to read the sound of a properly running engine, to adjust the needle valve by feel and by hearing, that child had developed something that lived in their hands and their ears for the rest of their life. The machinist who could hear a tool running wrong before the cut went bad. The mechanic who could diagnose an engine problem before the instrument confirmed it. The surgeon whose hands knew the difference between tissue that was ready and tissue that was not. These people did not come out of video games. They came out of physical engagement with systems that had requirements, and the engagement with those requirements produced knowledge that could not be acquired any other way. What replaced this? Not nothing. The digital world offers its own forms of complexity and engagement that develop their own kinds of knowledge and their own kinds of patience. But different kinds. Different senses, different feedback loops, different residues in the developing mind. The screen does not have the smell of model cement. The controller does not have the compression of a cold engine waiting to be started. The failure state of a digital game does not have the consequence of a flooded engine at a flying field, with an afternoon ahead of you and a model that will not run. The child of the 1960s, who built a model aircraft from a Testors kit and powered it with a McCoy, and flew it on a Saturday morning at an AMA field, was participating in something that was simultaneously a hobby and a form of education, and a social ritual and a physical training. They were learning to make things work. They were learning that things do not automatically work, that they require attention and patience, and a willingness to fail and try again. They were learning this not in a classroom, where the knowledge is abstract, but in a field, where the consequence of not knowing is a model sitting on the grass with a flooded engine while the afternoon passes. That is a specific kind of learning. It produces a specific kind of person. The question of whether we have lost it and what we might recover by understanding what it was is still open. If you have stayed with this story to the end, you already know something about what we're talking about. You have the patience to watch a long video about a company that most people under 40 have never heard of. And you have the patience for a reason. Leave your own memory in the comments. The hobby shop you went to, or the kit you built, or the engine that finally ran clean after 3 sessions of trying and one very specific adjustment to the needle valve. Those memories are the record that institutions won't keep. The record of what it felt like to do this, and what it meant, and what it gave to the people who did it. And then return to the smell. It is still there if you look for it, somewhere in the back of a hobby shop that has managed to survive, or in a garage where someone who retired 10 years ago is still building, or in a box in an attic where a set of Testor's enamel bottles from 1968 have been waiting with the patience of objects that do not know time has passed. The paint may have skinned over by now, or thickened past usability, but the bottles are still those specific small square glass containers with the brushed aluminum caps. And if you open one, the smell that comes out is the smell of a specific world. The Testor's McCoy engine is in that world too, in the hands of collectors who run them at vintage meets, or in display cases where they rest alongside the other small machines of that era. The Fox engines and the K&B units and the OK Cubs, each one a specific artifact of a manufacturing philosophy that held that quality and accessibility were not contradictory, that you could make something genuinely good and sell it to someone who was just starting out and trust them to learn what it required and reward them when they did. In 1955, told the Rockford Register Republic that where his company was at that moment didn't mean anything, that he hoped they never arrived, that he hoped they kept right on moving, He was describing a disposition more than a business plan. The disposition of someone who understood that the value of a thing is not in its current state, but in its direction. The hobby that the Testor's name inhabited was always in motion, always developing, always in the process of introducing new people to the pleasure of making something work. The question is whether that motion has stopped, or whether it has simply changed direction in ways that are harder to recognize from inside the moment. The model builder of 2025 is different from the model builder of 1963. The tools are different. The materials are different. The community infrastructure is different. But the underlying thing, the willingness to engage with a system that has requirements, and to meet those requirements and to receive the specific reward that comes when a made thing works, that may not be gone. It may simply be waiting for the right entry point. The smell of model cement and engine fuel is still findable. The patience that made it meaningful is still available. Whether we offer the next generation the chance to develop it is a question that we are still in the process of answering. The engine, if you have one and if you are willing, is ready to be started. Share.